Hi everyone. In this video we'll be looking at how to castle the king. We'll also be talking about when to castle the king and why we castle the king. And make sure you stick around to the end of the video because we'll also be talking about some side rules related to castling the king that you need to be aware of. So we'll start with the basics of castling the king. In this position it's white to move and white is now going to castle his king to safety. So to do that, white picks up the king on e1, moves it 2 squares to the right to the g1 square, and when the king is dropped, the rook is now automatically moved from h1 to f1 on the left hand side of the king. When you're playing online chess, this rook move will happen automatically, but when you're playing over the board chess, you will need to pick up the rook and move it yourself. And it's important to note at this point that you must touch the king first and move that 2 squares to the right before you then pick up the rook and move that. And you should also complete the castling procedure using the same hand. White has now castled kingside, and we refer to it as castling kingside because he's moved the king into the corner of the board on which the king starts. In terms of why white is castling the king is the most valuable piece in a game of chess, and so it's important that we bring the king to safety early on in the game. So a good way to do this is by castling the king into the corner of the board where it's then shielded by its own pawns. This also has the added benefit of bringing the rook into the game because the rook is now taken from the corner and moved towards the center of the board. Usually you should look to castle the king as soon as you can in the game, for the reason being that you then bring that king to safety early on, as we've discussed. You also develop the rook into the game, and it then allows you freedom to begin attacking your opponent, knowing that you can do so from a solid foundation. So now that we've had a look at castling kingside, we'll cover off castling queenside. It's the same procedure. White now moves the king 2 spaces to the left hand side, drops it on the c1 square, and this time the rook moves to the right hand side of the king on the d1 square. That covers the basics of castling kingside and castling queenside, but there are some important rules to be aware of when it comes to castling that we'll cover off now. The first thing to say, and here I'll just take it back a move, is you can't castle the king on either side of the board if you've already moved the king. So in this position, if instead of castling, white decided to move his king 1 square forward to the e2 square, let's say black plays a move here, queen to e7, and white now returns the king to the home square of e1. We'll play another waiting move for black, king to h8. In this position, white can't now castle the king. So even though the king is back on the starting square, and it looks like we should be able to do this, if I try and castle the king queenside, I'm unable to drop the king on the c1 square, and the same if I try and castle kingside, I can't actually drop the king onto the g1 square because it's already been moved. And the same is true of the rooks. If I tried to castle the king, but one of the rooks has been moved back and forth, then again the same limitation would kick in. I wouldn't be able to castle the king because it's an illegal move. The final piece that you need to be aware of when castling the king is related to check. So here we can see that the black rook is checking the white king, and in this scenario which I've set up here, white hasn't yet castled the king. So if white were to try and castle the king here and therefore castle out of the check, he wouldn't actually be able to do so, and we can see that here with the king flashing red. I'll just show that again, because you can't castle the king out of check. The same is true if you're trying to castle your king through a line of check or into check. So in this scenario, the black rook isn't actually checking the white king, instead it's staring down the f-file here, and because of that, the white king can't castle to the g1 square. So once again, I'm prevented from moving the king to g1 when I try to do so, and that's because of the black rook on f8. White would have the same issue if the rook was on g8. So that covers castling the king. I hope you found that helpful. Don't forget to like, comment, share, subscribe, and I hope to see you again on a future video.